Welcome everybody to the seminar. This is our second event this year, and this is being recorded, and we are hoping to release it publicly. So just please be aware if you have your if you do have your camera on, and if you ask questions, this will be captured and will be publicly available on the internet. If you do want to ask questions, then you can use the raise hand facility on Teams, and we'll just go through those in the order that they present. If you type a question in the chat, we are hoping to be able to capture those as well and read them out. We'll try to be fair and read them out in order in the time that we have available. And so we're joined today by Professor Mick Cooper from the University of Roehampton. Mick is a very well-known name in the field, has been involved in many things, such as development of concepts such as relational depth and contributions to existential therapies, as well as what he is planning to talk about today, the idea of pluralism and pluralistic therapy. And so without more ado, I'll pass on to Mick.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I feel really nervous about this talk, actually. I've been really anxious about it. And I guess it's kind of, I mean, I'm kind of aware that there's been a lot of, I don't know what I was going to say, debates, but I'm not, you know, sometimes it is debates in the field. Sometimes it's, I guess sometimes it's felt pretty heated. Sometimes it felt quite nasty. So I'm kind of slightly anxious about how this is going to unfold. And I had a slight kind of cold feet, and I said to Richard, shall I just do a big slide set? Originally, I was just going to I was hoping we could open it up to dialogue, and then I planned the big slide. I thought maybe I'd just do a big slide set and go through about kind of pluralism. But Richard said, well, maybe let's stick with, let's go with the dialogue. So I want to try that, but yeah, I'm kind of excited and looking forward to talking to people, but also anxious. And I kind of hope that maybe part of what we can do is also talk about the process, because, you know, I think in the person-centered field, that's kind of what we do, and what we're sometimes good at is talking about some of the kind of processes. And I think that some of what's happened between pluralistic and person-centered perspectives, certainly from my sense, isn't just about the kind of content or the kind of ideas, but it's also about personalities, and it's about kind of emotions, and about people's sense of identity, and, you know, of course mine as much as everybody else's, and about how we get defensive about stuff, and how we can feel threatened and scared and vulnerable. So, you know, I hope we can kind of talk about some of those things as well, and maybe find a way of talking that perhaps crosses both the kind of emotional side and the conceptual side, and doesn't kind of pretend that those feelings aren't there, because certainly for me, maybe it's just me, but you know, I think that is an important part of what's happened in the dialogue and the debate so far. Also just kind of the process thing really is that originally I think we said I do a kind of introduction, but I think talking to Richard about it, I get a sense that it's an experienced group. So I wanted to maybe just start at a kind of slightly further on level, and kind of carrying on some of the discussions that have already had, rather than kind of starting at the beginning. So I'm kind of assuming people have a basic understanding of some of the concepts around pluralism, and hopefully there's a series of dialogues that I did with a guy called Chris Molyneux, who was down in Brighton, where we've done about 4 hours or so now. Well, I think we kind of tried to unpack, and maybe, I don't know, Richard, if you're able to pop in the chat or somebody the link to those videos or on Chris's or my YouTube pages, because I think they kind of give a sense of some of the debates and dialogue so far, and I'd like to think that it's a kind of example of us kind of listening and trying to look at some of the issues. And I think one of the things I realized a while back about dialogue, John McLeod and I actually, on something unrelated, but I think back in like 2006 or 2007 at a psychotherapy research conference, we did, there's something you might have heard of called consensual qualitative research. And we developed this idea, which we never really saw through, called dialogical qualitative research. And the idea was that we were going to take a question, like listen to a case study or look at a kind of transcripts of sessions. And whereas consensual qualitative research was about people kind of sharing, and, you know, Clara Hill developed it, and it's a really valuable method. But we had this idea that maybe you could also have dialogue. People would talk about the case study, and they would actually, rather than come to consensus, they would develop different positions and different understandings. And the point was just to kind of monitor that process. So we tried it. And one of the things I noticed about dialogue, I mean, I'm really interested in dialogue, and I imagine we might come back to talking about dialogue and what dialogue means and the nature of dialogue. But one of the things I noticed about dialogue is often in dialogue, what happens is that it helps you, rather than coming together and kind of coming closer to the other person, sometimes what it does is it helps you kind of formulate and clarify and understand more of what you think and how you understanding. And sometimes actually you're further away from the other person, not in a bad way, but just in a sense of more clarity and more understanding of where you're coming from. And I think the dialogues with Chris, certainly, I think for both of us, kind of helped us clarify some of the issues. So what I wanted to do is maybe just try not to talk for too long, but just to, and as I say, rather than present a kind of introduction to pluralism, this is, you know, that might come up later, but just talk about some of the kind of issues that I think, sorry, I'm full of cold, by the way, but to some of the issues that, or kind of clarifications that emerge through those conversations. So it's a little bit random, but just some of the things that kind of struck me as I was preparing for this. And I think one of the first ones is about, like in thinking about pluralism, what I realized is that I don't think we were always as clear as we could be about the difference between a pluralistic philosophy and a pluralistic practice. And people often talk about pluralism and the pluralistic approach. And there is a kind of commonality, a common thread. And certainly that there are kind of common meanings. But I think those two things, like sometimes when people talk about pluralism, they just say, you know, pluralism says this and pluralism says that. And actually it's really useful. And I hope when we have a conversation and we talk about these things later, that we talk about, do we mean pluralism as a practice or do we mean pluralism as a philosophy? And just to say a little bit more. So for me, pluralism as a philosophy, what we've articulated by that, what we try to say by that is that, and I think it's partly important to clarify this just because when we talk about what is a relationship with person-centered, they have kind of different relationships and it depends on what we mean by person-centered as well. So it's important to pull apart. But pluralistic philosophy is really, I guess I'd describe it as that belief that there's lots of different therapeutic approaches that can be of value, and that different clients benefit from different things at different points in time, and that not often, the kind of best way of finding out what might be helpful for clients is by some kind of collaborative dialogical process with them, to work with them to work out what is going to be most helpful. And I think by that, and for me, that kind of pluralistic philosophy, I guess, is I'm particularly, you know, I think me and John also have slightly different emphases and different areas of interest. I think for me, that pluralistic philosophy, like what does it mean to think about therapy as a whole from that kind of pluralistic frame, and to think about different approaches of being of value, thinking about the kind of difference and diversity across clients, I guess kind of questioning the idea or challenging the idea, or trying to move away from the idea that there's one right way of doing therapy and one kind of best therapy. And also, of course, not just therapies, but also different practices, running, medication sometimes, yoga. But actually, there's lots of different things that can be helpful for people. And different people are helped in different ways. But I think really importantly, when we talk about pluralism as a philosophy, and I'll come back to this, but for me, that pluralistic philosophy is an expression of person-centered thinking and values at a kind of meta level. It's a kind of person, for me, that would be a person-centered way of thinking about the therapy world as a whole. That pluralistic philosophy doesn't mean integrative practice, and I think that's where maybe some of the confusion has come in. It doesn't mean that therapists then should be doing 450 different kinds of therapy and moving between CBT and person-centered and mixing all these different approaches. It might be that, because within that pluralistic philosophy, it might be that somebody very clearly says, I'm a classical, my practice is classical person-centered therapy, or my practice is EFT or Gestalt therapy or CBT. That's a very embracing of single modality practices. But it's also a single modality practice recognizing that there are other very valid and valuable ways of working. And different clients will need and benefit from different things at different points in time, and that we might have a client who comes to us as a CBT therapist, for instance, and says, like, I really want space to talk and to have an opportunity for somebody to really help me understand my problems, and that rather than maybe saying, well, what you need is CBT, that I can value that maybe that client needs something different. In the same way that somebody who's maybe asking for skills and techniques coming to a person-centered therapist, that person-centered therapist wouldn't then go, all right, I'll come and do CBT with you, but would recognize that maybe there's a different way of working that would suit them, that our way of working isn't always the best way. So there's something about that pluralistic philosophy, which, as I say, I would think about as a kind of person-centered meta perspective on therapy. And then there's pluralistic practice, which is where you are beginning to combine and bring together different ways of working, whether that's person-centered and CBT or person-centered psychodynamic. And what makes that kind of different, what I would say is kind of unique about that, maybe not unique, but for me, what would be particular about that is the kind of collaborative nature of that working together, which, people often say, what's the difference in integrative and pluralistic? And I think for me, what makes something pluralistic as a practice is that there's there's a focus on collaborating, working together, trying to work out together what is going to be the most helpful thing for that particular client. I mean, colleagues of mine like John Norcross would say, well, that's integrative. And that is by definition an integrative practice, and in integrative you do that. I think, again, if you look at the relationship between pluralism and integration, you need to think about, well, these different kind of ways of thinking about pluralism, but then also the different models of integration. And certainly some integrative models lend themselves, like a kind of assimilative integrative, or common factors, lend themselves to a kind of pluralistic practice. But I think there's others, like kind of more theoretical forms of integration, where you're combining particular approaches into a particular modality that may be collaborative but aren't necessarily collaborative. I don't think integrative is necessarily collaborative. I'd like to think it is, but it doesn't need to be. Whereas I think when we're talking about pluralism, we are talking about, as a practice, we're talking about a particular way of working that really has collaboration, or tries to have collaboration at its heart. And then that is integrative. And I think I'm absolutely clear that a kind of pluralistic practice is different from a classical person-centered practice. And I never want to, suggest that they are the same thing, or that a kind of pluralistic practice is the same as classical. But what we mean by person-centered also is something that I'll come on to in a minute, and to discuss a bit about that. I think So that's one distinction that I think is important to hold on to, is about pluralism as a practice versus pluralism as a kind of philosophy, as an attitude, which has different implications. And then the next one is about kind of normative versus foundational pluralism. And I think, again, this is something that some of the critiques of pluralism that I've seen is sometimes a bit, it is kind of not recognize exactly what it is we're saying. So when I talk about normative versus foundational pluralism, if you look at the literature on pluralism, there's different ways of different, and this is not just about pluralistic therapy, this comes from pluralism as a philosophy. There's kind of different levels of pluralism. So foundational pluralism is like basically relativism. It's a pluralism that goes all the way down. It's a pluralism that says that there are no fundamental values, that there's no fundamental truths, that everything is kind of relative, including, of course, pluralism itself, and that there's no fundamental knowledge. Normative pluralism there's more, it's not pluralism all the way down. There's more of a kind of base to it. And I very much, and what we say in the 2011 book John McLeod and I wrote, is that the kind of pluralism we're talking about is a normative pluralism. It's not, sometimes I've seen things saying, well, pluralism is just postmodernism and everything's a kind of mush. And that's not, the pluralism is there for a reason. There's a foundation to it. That's really important to communicate. And that was the whole reason for me and John, and I think for others, to articulate that. Now, for me, the foundation, that kind of the concrete, if you like, that underlines it all, is about ethics. And it's about a particular way of relating to people. And pluralism isn't there as a kind of, as an ontological statement. And I think that, something David and I talked about a long time ago is about the difference between ontology and ethics. And that's come up a lot in these discussions, and maybe we'll come back to that. But for me, the foundations of pluralism are in a particular set of ethics. And this is rooted in the philosophy of people like Levinas, who argue that philosophy fundamentally needs to ask questions about ethics, that it needs to ask questions about how do you treat people well. And pluralism, the idea of valuing difference, which is kind of how I see pluralism, as a kind of valuing, a celebration of difference, a kind of recognition of difference, isn't there so much for a kind of ontological reason. I mean, you could argue it ontologically, and some people have argued it ontologically, that there's no truth, and that there's always multiple answers to different questions. But really, for me, certainly, that's not the bit that's interesting. For me, why pluralism is important is because it is in the service of a particular set of values, which is about how do we treat people well, how do we respect people. And my training was began with some person-centered, did a certificate, and then went on to do existential therapy. And in existential therapy, I was particularly influenced by the work of Buber, and about the idea of the I-thou stance. And something that Buber talks about, and I really took from Buber and Buber's work, is that the I-thou stance is something to relate to another as a thou rather than an it. Is to recognize the distinctiveness and the uniqueness and the non categorizability of the other, that the other always transcends our fixed structures within which our schema, our kind of boxes, if you like, in a kind of more prosaic terms, are boxes within which we would tend to put people. And Buber, beautifully, if you read some of his work, like his book about his paper about dialogue, which is an amazing text, talks about the nature of dialogue, and he talks a lot about armor, and he talks about the way that we all have armor which defends ourselves against the words of the world, and that in the I-thou meeting there is a movement. It's not that we take the armor off, but that something comes through that armor, and that there is a connection, and there's a touching. And of course, this relates to the work then on relational depth, which for me was a really important kind of precursor, I guess, in some ways, of pluralism. And I see them as very related, because I think relational depth, when we ask the question, what does it mean to relate to someone deeply? there's something very important about touching the uniqueness and the distinctiveness and the non-categorizability of the other. And so I think pluralism is there as a way of articulating that connection with an otherness. And of course that's then taken forward in the work of Levinas, who whereas I guess Buber is still in a more perhaps ontological position about describing the nature of things, Levinas makes the ethical assumptions more explicit, and talks about that ethical requirement, and then people in the person-centered field like Peter Schmidt really draw on Levinas and use that as kind of way of thinking about what therapy is, that meeting of the otherness. But in this it was interesting in the discussion with Chris, and I think that's one place we got to like how in talking about how we understand person-centered therapy and what person-centered therapy ultimately is, and how do we define it in different understandings. Like, do we understand that in ontological terms? Is it about a particular theory of being? Is it about a particular theory of practice? Like I think Chris was saying, for him, the definition of person-centered was ultimately in terms of the core conditions, and that was the kind of the basis for what is and what isn't person-centered. And I guess for me, I understand it. I understand it in terms of, well, I'll come back to this, but I think I would like to understand it, is maybe a better way of putting it, in terms of ethics. For me, I think that is the most important thing, and I would like to think in the person-centered world that is the most important thing. And I think that well, this is maybe something we want to talk about. I think for most people in the person-centered world, ultimately what they care about and what matters to them is the ethics rather than the ontology, or the specific practices. Because I think that people, I mean, we all know that person-centered is incredibly compelling for people. And I think why I think it's compelling for people is not because of a particular model of the person. I mean, I think that's important, and I also don't think it's about a particular practice. I think why the person-centered approach compels people and why people love it so much is because what they see in it is a way of deeply valuing, respecting others from a position of humility, from a position of care, from a position of love, as somebody like Suzanne Keyes might say. That it's not a kind of cold, hard, clinical ontology. It's not about people are like this, people are like that. This is the nature of being. It's about how we relate to others. And so I'll come back to this, but I think, in trying to articulate what person-centered is, like I kind of move between thinking that actually maybe person-centered isn't about an ethics of care. It's not about pluralism. It's about something different, and that's fine. And then sometimes coming back to saying, actually, I really think like what Rogers was trying to articulate was something about how we relate to others. That was really his message. Wasn't about. It was more than just people are like potatoes in a basement. So a student was asking me yesterday about whether Rogers really had potatoes in his basement. We got into this long discussion about, did he really have basement? And like, why was he giving potatoes in his basement? And what does all that mean? But, I think that, I think for me that, and maybe that's because, so something else that came out was interesting in the dialogue with Chris, was thinking about my own kind of like what person-centered means to me. And, something Chris pointed out to me was that, like, when I was doing an undergraduate psychology degree, I read and was really moved by Rogers' 61 on becoming a person. And I think that's probably my Rogerian touchstone, is his description of what it means to be and in relationship with others, what it means to be in process. Interestingly for Chris, it was the earlier stuff, like 1957, paper particularly that was like the kind of touchstone, and maybe part of how we understand person-centered is about the links and where we kind of locate and what's been most important for us. I think one other thing I just want to say about Levinas though is that thing about ontology is that is the relationship between Levinas and Heidegger is very interesting, because in this question about what is most important, is philosophy is the question an ethical question or a ontology? You know, as I'm sure you know, there's a lot of discussion about Heidegger and Heidegger's involvement with the Nazis, and the fact that there was no contrition and never seemed to apologize for that. And you know, Heidegger in the existential world, we absolutely love Heidegger. He you know, his philosophy and his questions of being and the way that he develops a kind of ontology of being in the world is just overwhelmingly brilliant. If you read Being and Time, it's just absolutely mind-blowing. I remember reading it and just, it was like kind of taking drugs. It was, you know, I didn't understand half of it, but I still just came away from it. It's just such a massively transformed worldview. But you know, this was somebody who also, you see pictures of him dressed up in a Nazi outfit. He was pretty horrible to Husserl, who's Jewish, as I understand it. His ethics, you know, and he never, just Paul Celan, who was a Jewish poet. I was just, my partner and I were kind of listening to podcasts and reading about the relationship between the two, and just the way that Paul Celan, as a Jewish poet, could never get Heidegger, or Heidegger could never apologize. And so I think that, you know, the issue here, and for Levinas, it was like, you know, okay, you've got this great ontology, you've got this kind of model of being, which you know, like Rogers is a deeply developed and very compelling model of being. But what does all that mean if actually the way that you relate to people, or that you relate to humanity, is in such an inhuman way, or had been for some time? So I think that, you know, the kind of debates, or, you know, it's a different discussion, but I think this question about ontology, ethics, practice, where does the person-centered approach sit, is one that is an important one, I think. And I think being able to stand back and consider these different positions and think about it from these different perspectives, I guess for me, feels important. Something else that comes up, so I'm going on a bit, but something else that came up for me with a dialogue with Chris was about like questions of taxonomy versus questions of effectiveness. And I think probably, or well, maybe not effectiveness is the right word, but kind of questions of what's most helpful in therapy versus what is person-centered. So I guess what Chris was saying, which I you know, people said, is that, you know, it's not that I have an issue with pluralism, and pluralism practice, I'm sure, is very helpful, but it's just not person-centered. And it's really important to recognize and to say, well, this is person-centered, and what person-centered is. And then, you know, I'm not saying this is Chris, I'm not saying pluralism is bad, but it's just that it's something different. So that's the kind of, you know, so there was a kind of debate around taxonomy, but I think woven into that, and then when we were talking about it, I think I was feeling like, yeah, I get that, and I can absolutely see that that's distinctive from questions about maybe what's effective or isn't effective, what's helpful or isn't helpful for clients. But I think actually they do weave together, because it goes back to something I was saying earlier about, and I'm not articulating very well, but it's something about, you know, what person-centered should be. And I think I kind of move in and out between really wanting at times person-centered to be an approach that will be really effective. So, you know, a lot of my work has been in the empirical field, research, reviewing research like Denbrook's Facts Friendly, which I'm just working on at the moment, and has been on the research. So that when I see something that where it feels like the research is pointing in one direction and person-centered is pointing in another direction, which happens sometimes, I guess my temptation is to want to see if we can shift the person-centered to align it more closely with maybe what the research is saying, which kind of taxonomically taxonomically, you might say that's problematic. But for me, like coming out in the 2000s, what happened in the 2000s when CBT came in, we had a lot of counsellors, person-centred counsellors working in primary care, and we really saw that decimated with the rise of CBT and Roehampton. I was really around and really involved in a lot of those discussions and working with BACP and on different panels and groups and looking at those discussions. And I was really affected emotionally, and I know a lot of people at BACP were as well, by what it felt was happening to the person-centred field. So I think questions around what is person-centred and seeing what people like, for instance, Robert Elliott, and just how powerfully the work of people like Robert Elliott or Bill Miller in motivational interviewing has really provided a spur for the person-centred field at times when I felt quite hopeless and scared, I think, for what's going to happen to person-centred therapy or humanistic approaches, and wanting to be able to, I guess, articulate an approach that has a kind of a humanistic approach that is able to be effective, not effective, sorry, is able to be something that we can be proud of and advocate for and really feel has a place in the therapy world. And so that, I think, raises questions. And I do genuinely think, something, maybe this is a bit personal, but I do sometimes feel that some of the things that come at me is like kind of have been quite attacking or accusatory about kind of like, well, you're saying it like this because you want to promote pluralism or it's in your interest to do that. I mean, I think the way that I've looked at the research is I started very much, I mean, in my early work was a lot about school counselling, person-centred school counselling, and working around relational depth. And it would really have been in my interest if I'd seen data and evidence and research in our school counselling staff and in the wider field, and when I was doing the Facts Are Friendly, showing that person-centred was the most effective approach and the best approach and the right approach for clients, that would have been so brilliant for me. I mean, I would have loved that. And for a long time, I think I was really looking for that and hoping to see that evidence. But I was coming across research that was questioning that. And some of the, like one of the studies that's going to be coming out soon was about person-centred counselling in schools, which a lot of the kids loved, but some of the kids were like about 30% of the kids were saying things like they didn't like the silences, or to some degree they felt uncomfortable with the silences. I mean, when we did our ethos study of school-based counselling, I would have loved nothing more than it to be incredibly effective, really showing really, really positive change. And it showed good change. It showed really good change on goals, and that was great to see. But then what do you do with something like where a third of the kids say, actually, I found I don't like the silences, and I wish the counsellor had done a bit more. To varying degrees, from actually the silences was so awful I wanted to drop out, to it was great counselling, but I just wish they'd done a little bit more. One thing is to try and find a way around that and to say, well, look, actually the person-centred counselling is great, and so I hold on to that. But to say, well, actually they weren't really person-centred doing person-centred counselling, but actually we did really carefully adherence check. People would listen to the recording, so we used the PCCS YP, so it was about as robust as it could get. And also, I guess to me, it would feel disingenuous to to look at that evidence through that particular lens and try and kind of reinterpret it in a way that suited my kind of person-centered leanings. The reality is that that some of the kids did find the aspects of the therapy difficult, and I think if we want to develop an effective therapy, we kind of need to be open to that. And I kind of feel also that when Rogers talks about things like the Facts Are Friendly, for me, being person-centered is about that openness, that welcoming of the data, rather than that kind of rigidity of saying, well, I'm because it doesn't fit my schema, there must be something wrong with the data, or it wasn't really person-centered therapy. I think we've got a massive challenge in the person-centered, far more than pluralism. Is Michael Barkham's and colleagues' practice trial. which I know David was involved with, and other people, you know, which I'm sure people know really well. You know, there's this big study sitting out there which shows that, from what we can see, that at 6 months in IAP, person-centered does as well as CBT, but it's 12 months, CBT does better. Not massively better, it's a small effect size, but it does do better. And there's going to be qualitative research coming out of that, like there's qualitative research coming out of Ethos, which is going to be talking about some of the experiences and some of the things that the clients experienced in CBT that maybe they didn't experience in person-centered therapy. And I think, you know, this question for us as a field, like, how do we respond to that? Do we go, well, we know person-centered therapy is, you know, as good as CBT, and therefore it must be that they weren't really doing person-centered therapy? Or dismiss it in some other way? Or do we find a way of kind of learning from that? And again, for me, I think there's something about person-centered therapy, which is that the challenge at that kind of meta level is to challenge myself, ourselves, even though it's uncomfortable, even though it doesn't feel good, to actually say, okay, what can I learn from this? Like, I think one of the things that might come out is that in the CBT, they learned skills to take away, which was also what our kids were asking, is that they wanted to learn skills. And I think there's a bit of a pattern. If you look at the Kuiper's meta-analysis, you know, there's been a lot of debates about the Dodo verdicts over the years, and, you know, are all therapies equivalent? Kuiper's analysis, even taking into account allegiance effects, shows that all the therapies are equivalent, apart from some forms of supportive person-centered counselling for depression, which does slightly worse, not terribly worse, but slightly worse. You know, that's another research finding that I think we kind of need to look at, and need to look at seriously, and need to see what it means. So here's the last thing I want to say then. There's loads more I want to say, but I'm going to open up to dialogue. Is that, you know, is pluralism a person-centered approach? And what the difference is? I think it's so dependent on what we mean and what we understand by person-centered. I think if we understand person-centered as the classical approach, and we say that the kind of classical, maybe based around the core conditions, that is person-centered, then that could be compatible with a pluralistic philosophy. It's quite compatible to say that a pluralistic philosophy still comes out of that person-centered kind of way of thinking about things. It's kind of a meta level. But clearly that person-centered classical practice, if we understand person-centered in that way, it's different from a pluralistic practice, and we're talking about two different things there, although we might say that the values are pretty similar. But that's one way of understanding person-centered, and I think it's a bit of a, you know, one of the things that came out for me in the discussion with Chris is I think it's a bit of an Anglo-centric way of understanding what it means to be person-centered, or Anglo-speaking, because if you look in places like Ukraine, Poland, I think, Belgium, you know, there's really different understandings of what means person-centered. Like, one of the debates we had when we did the person-centered handbook was whether things like the experiential therapies, emotion focusing, do we understand that as person-centered as well? And actually the decision, which I was mixed about, but the decision was to use person-centered as an umbrella term for all the family. And Pete Sanders does that actually in the Tribes of the Person-Centered Nation. You know, some people would say that's person-centered experiential. I think in counselling for depression, they use the term person-centered experiential, but others use the term person-centered. And certainly in part of the reason that we use the term person-centered to refer to that whole family was because actually in a lot of places like Ukraine, for instance, that's what they do. And they just call these things person-centered. So I think the relationship kind of depends a bit by what we mean by person-centered, and whether we think, you know, that there's one definition or one understanding. As I say, I think my understanding of how I would like to think about person-centered is that it's an approach which most fundamentally, beyond the core conditions, beyond the idea of the actualizing tendency, which is what Pete, I think Pete defined it in terms of the actualizing tendency. For me, it's about a deep stance of respect towards clients, about engaging with clients in a way that really kind of honors and values them, that comes from a position of humility. And it's interesting, some of the research now on humility in therapy and just how important that can be. That sees the relationship as an equal one, that doesn't put ourselves above the client, but sees it as a more kind of equal relationship, and embodies those principles from people like Mbuba, of dialogue, of transparency, of David's work about, Mercy's work about mutuality. That these are really kind of like that core qualities, and that's the essence of it. And out of that kind of stance comes a fluidity, a flexibility, an openness, an openness to the research evidence, a willingness to change our mind, to say we're wrong, that we've got stuff wrong, rather than having a kind of fixed, I think like this, and that's it. I think that's a really important part of it for me. And I think, yeah, so I kind of think that's what Rogers was saying, and I guess that's why I kind of think it was that's what I don't think Rogers, if he was around today, and we can hypothesize what we want, but I just don't think it'd be somebody saying, right, this is what you need to do, or this is how it is, and if you're saying that, you're over there and you're outside of us. I was thinking about this just before this talk, and just thinking that I imagine Rogers is kind of warm, friendly, flexible, dialogical person. When he was talking to Skinner, he wasn't saying I'm right, you're wrong. He was interested and collaborative, and what I guess what I would see is pluralistic. So the very, 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 very last thing I just wanted to, because also all of this has then got, well, let me just show, I just want to show one slide, and then I absolutely will shut up. Just like how I would see these like different kind of things coming together. So I guess for me, I would see like that pluralistic philosophy as the same of what I would understand as the foundation of person-centered, about that kind of deep respect and valuing of clients in their uniqueness. And I think that then can underpin a pluralistic practice. And I think you can also equally underpin a classical person-centered practice, or any other kind of person-centered practice. I think what's added to the complexities, and it's nice to have Nicola here, my colleague Nicola, is also when we talk about person-centered pluralism, which I think again is something slightly different, which is a form of pluralism, a kind of form of opening up. Nicola might see it slightly differently, but I would see it that in her chapter in the Tribes book, as a kind of form of opening up, and that collaborative practice maybe drawing in a bit more, but still quite associated with a kind of more classical person-centered practice in the core conditions, in a way that, say, something like a pluralistic transactional analysis or pluralistic Gestalt approach wouldn't in its practice be so similar to a classical person-centered practice. And I guess where I see that differently, and then like I was wandering around Copenhagen a few weeks ago and thinking about like, what is it that I get upset about? And I think the word that came to my mind is a kind of fundamentalism, and maybe that's just too harsh, and maybe that's not a good word to use. But I sometimes feel, one thing I realised is actually I'd always kind of seen classical approach and a kind of more, this is the right way, kind of you can't see it any other way, as being kind of overlapping. And actually there is sometimes some overlap, but I think there is a kind of person-centered fundamentalism, which I see sometimes in some of the kind of comments about this is the only way of seeing person-centered. If you sing it over that, like some of the terms, when I read things like people saying, "Oh, pluralism is just rubbish and it's not person-centered and it's what was it? A toxic abomination." Something says and when I read that, I think, for me, there's a kind of narrowness there, which I think then that isn't compatible with a pluralism. And I think a pluralism is kind of pushed back against that kind of person-centered fundamentalism, which sometimes overlaps with classical, but by no means needs to do so. And at that point, I think that's when I kind of feel ambivalent, because part of me thinks like, if we want to see person-centered and pluralism as different thing, that's fine. It's kind of like time to just let go of it. But then I also think when I read some of that stuff and when I hear some of the ways, and I guess see person-centered being used in that way, in the same way that people kind of see pluralism and have talked about it as a kind of betrayal of kind of core person-centered values. I see that in a way that people talking about different colleagues' work as being toxic abomination, or being, you know, like, to quote some other things, like being clutter or delulu or foolish or phony or wacky. I just think actually that's not what person-centered therapy is about, and that's not why people come into the person-centered field. And actually somebody needs to say, there is a need to say, you know, one of the things David and Stephen were writing about it as pluralism being unnecessary. But I guess when I read stuff like that, I think actually there is a need for something to say, this isn't really what for me anyway, I don't think that's what person-centered should be about. I think it should be about a valuing and a respect. And if people are talking to others like that in this community, something has gone wrong, and actually something needs to be said about a different way of being person-centered, which is about that deep valuing respect. And that's where I see a kind of place for pluralism. Sorry, I went much over what I was going to say.
Thank you. So we are open to, well, Mick is open to questions, and if
nice
anyone
questions.
Please raise your hand if you would like to have your microphone unmuted and be able to say something. David Murphy is first up.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can.
Very good. Thank you, Mick, for that introduction to what we're going to talk about. I'm only responding now, really not because I had a burning question, but just because you sort of decided to mention my name right at the end. So I thought I needed to say something about that, because you sort of associated it with a lot of other views and a lot of other expressions and terms that you know, I haven't used. So I'd say that the term unnecessary, and the other term for people that aren't aware in the title of the paper was incompatible, was, I think, actually saying something that you've said yourself about, hinted at tonight, but also in your dialogues with Chris. I don't think we were saying anything different about that. Is that there's a form of pluralistic practice which is incompatible with person-centered. I think in the last talk with Chris, you and Chris agreed that there's a form of pluralistic practice which is not person-centered, and then there is in your diagram there you had a sort of overlap with some forms of pluralistic practice that overlaps with client-centered therapy, and I could see that would be possible, and that was the unnecessary bit. So it seems to me that the incompatible and the unnecessary statement was just saying that there is a part of pluralistic practice that's unnecessary because it overlaps and we already do those things, and there is a way of pluralistic practice which is incompatible. So I don't think that paper actually says anything that you've not said in your talks with Chris or pointed at there this evening. And yeah, so I don't know what else to sort of say about that, other than I think maybe you felt like it was a bit unfair or a bit harsh to have the title of a paper like that. But actually, I think the arguments in the paper are really sound, and I think they would be great to be sort of responded to in another paper, and there could be a sort of healthy academic debate about those thoughts about the two approaches. Anyway, I didn't really have a question, so I'm going to mute now, because like I say, I only responded because you'd mentioned my name alongside some of the other things that have been said.
Yeah, thanks, David. And just to say that, yeah, absolutely, that paper doesn't say wacky. Wacky, I don't think features in that, or phony. Yeah. Should we take some comments, Richard, and then I'll respond, or do you want me to do it one by one?
So, I mean, I have seen some comments in the chat. I know that I was keeping an eye on that. I don't know if you have any.
I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat. Just it's hard to kind of read that and talk at the same time.
Yeah, there is a bit of a conversation going on in the chat. I'm just going to start with the last question, though, that seems to come directly at you, Mick. So I'm just going to read it out loud by Sarah Ellis. I'm very new to all of this, so forgive me any ignorance here, but I noticed that you seem to mention the concept of respect or deep respect for the client a lot. Can I ask, is it that you feel this is lacking in the person-centered approach?
That's a good question. I think no. I think that it's lacking in a, to use that term, and again, apologies if it's not the right term, but I think in a fundamentalist person-centered approach, there's a risk that it is lacking. I think, I think that person-centered practitioners generally work in very respectful ways and very helpful ways. But I think if somebody is going in to a client thinking that I know what this person needs, then there is a risk that it can become less respectful because it's putting the therapist's expertise before maybe what the client thinks, wants, needs. And I think that an approach that is based on those core conditions, for instance, and it isn't using, isn't willing to use or isn't open to the idea that for that client, actually, some particular technique, some particular method, some particular psychoeducation is helpful, where there's a rigidity there, that there's a risk that that becomes not as respectful because it's not as responsive to that individual. Now, how prevalent that is in the person-centered field, I think, is an empirical question, and I just don't know. And I'd hate, and I think maybe some of what we've written reads as we're saying that person-centered people aren't respectful or are kind of closed-minded in that way, and then that becomes offensive, and that's why people get upset about it. And I understand that, and maybe we've got stuff wrong there or put stuff badly, but I think that to some extent it can happen. I think to some extent it can happen, and I think like I say, with if kids, and this isn't just in a study where we ask practitioners practice a person-centered way, when we've done research in school counselling just in one setting over the years, it's not that kids have felt that, it's not that they said they felt disrespectful, but I think sometimes they have felt that their needs haven't been entirely heard. And then I think there's ways that could be more deeply valuing and respectful of that difference. And I think we need to think about what, I think it's useful to think about maybe what they would be.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll take a question from Palanasamai V. Hopefully you can unmute.
Yeah, thank you. So Palanisamai from India. So I have an observation that so the Carl Roger, he was against the categorization or a classification, in fact, individuals under disorder. But the paradox is that now his theory is under classification. We're saying classical or a fundamental person-centered approach. I'm not judging your rejecting your idea. That is fine if you see in that way. But my suggestion is that, in fact, you can leave the theory, a person-centered approach, or make it as simply a pluralistic approach, a separate,
Are you, sorry, Palinasamy, are you talking about it as a practice or the philosophy? Just to be specific, because I think it's helpful just to be specific.
Sorry, I couldn't understand. I said, I think you can leave the person-centered approach altogether and make pluralistic approaches, separate approach. Because if Carl Roger is alive today, if he is here now, I think he'll not be happy. It's how we see and evaluate and see, the core principles of a person-centered approach. I think it's highly misunderstood. There is no actually approach or a philosophy in person-centered approach. It's all about being simple, human. That is same for any time in 1960s, 70s, 80s, 2024. So we have to be human. If you are a modern, day, you have to be just who you are now. So that you have to show present there. You don't need to worry about what happened in 1960s. How I am human today, what I think today, how I express myself today. It's naturally it's there. The development, the modern, approach actually integrated in the person-centered approach. As we ever, evolving with a lot of development. So that will reflect definitely in your communication. So it's already updated. As human beings are updated, the theory also updated because it's not fixed with any rigid theory or at time or 1960s or 70s or 80s. I think we have to actually put a lot of effort in understanding what Carl Roger actually argued, and also we have to have a real interest in people. We should not taken away by the market, the fame, the name, the acceptance by the society. I think that is what made us to rethink and taking different things, and we're losing confidence. Instead of that, we have to just simply be a human being and do away with the market, the demand, and the fame, and rejection. So that is my humble opinion.
Thank you.
Maybe.
I mean, just to go back to what you're saying about kind of it evolves. So I think, see, Chris, when I was talking to him, was saying something different. I mean, he was defining the person-centered approach in terms of what Carl Rogers wrote in 1957, or what was published in 1957, which is over 60 years ago. And, that really worries me, because I think that, in today's, you can talk about, I mean, I hear you saying we shouldn't worry about the market, but if we want people to be able to access this kind of therapy in the NHS and in schools and in voluntary sectors, people want evidence. People want to see evidence and argument that something is actually working. And I think if you present them with something and say, well, this is something that was developed in 1957, and Carl Rogers, this is effective because Carl Rogers said it was in 1957, versus an approach that's saying, here's the latest RCT that is showing that something's effective and it's evolved and it's developed and now there's more evidence for it. That people are going to find the latter argument much more compelling. So I think it's a real risk to define something in terms of, and it's not even as if Carl Rogers, as I understand it, said this is the person-centered approach, this is what it is in 1957. He said this is a set of hypotheses about what might be necessary and sufficient for therapeutic personality change. And somehow it's kind of become embedded in this kind of set in stone that this is the person-centered approach, so that somebody like Chris and many other people would say person-centered is the core conditions. But I don't think that's a definition that allows it to grow and evolve and become something contemporary. I think it needs some other foundation, which is why for me ethics provides some kind of foundation that kind of would allow it that flexibility to be able to be fittedness and change for the different kind of needs and for different evidence. What do you do? If you define something in terms of the core conditions and say, well, we're defining our approach in terms of empathy, UPR, congruence. What do you do if actually the evidence, as it does, shows that, for instance, there's factors like goal agreement that are much more associated with positive outcomes than congruence? Do you kind of stick to the things that Roger said, even though there's evidence against it? It raises a lot of challenges. CBT, I think, is in many ways much more fluid. And actually, I'd say that in many ways, CBT at that meta level is more person-centered, because it has that kind of fluid growth, evolution, responding to the evidence. I don't see how something kind of which ties itself to 1957 is particularly growing.
Okay, so we have Ornella is next in line. Hopefully you can unmute. Oh, there you are. Great.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. And I know somehow it might be a bit anxious for you, but I hope you feel welcome for our question. One of mine is somehow, in what ways can a pluralistic approach that integrates, for example, CBT with person-centered enhance the client journey toward their actualization tendency and their own authenticity? I was wondering how can that pluralism approach let an unconditional environment where the client can somehow actualize in a positive way.
Do you mean a pluralistic practice? When people keep on disappearing once they put their hands down, it's where's Ornella gone? I want to see. Oh, there you are. You're down there in the corner. I can see you. So do you mean that, like, how can a pluralistic practice help somebody actualize? Is that the question?
Yeah, somehow with the structure, techniques.
And when you say, we were just teaching this week actually, when you say actualization, what do you mean?
I'm talking about the foundation somehow of the person-centered, where the clients strive to match their innate growth towards what their ultimate functioning might be. So like aligning their ideal self with their real self.
Yeah, okay. So I think that personally from a kind of relation, so this is where again kind of relational depth ideas come in a bit, because when we developed ideas around relational depth, for me, and I can't speak for anybody else involved in that, I think there was a bit of move away from that model of the person. So some of the critiques of that kind of Rogerian model of the person, the idea that there's kind of this potential deep inside that the conditions allow us to actualize. I struggle with that. And I struggle with that because it feels quite individualistic, and it starts with like a lot of contemporary thinkers, I think, from a more intersubjective standpoint, would say that idea that there is a kind of self with a kind of inner organismic valuing potential doesn't take into account the kind of relational nature of being. So in the relational depth work, I think, and in the work of someone like Peter Schmidt, who kind of moves between the two different positions, there's more a sense of kind of like being is between us, and that very much like Buber, being is in the experiencing, and Heidegger essentially, being is in the between, it's in the relationship rather than something that just is in the person. So when I think about realization and actualization, I think it more in a kind of relational sense of like kind of learning and being in community and less kind of like our own inmost potential, which I never quite understand what that kind of means about kind of actualizing our inmost potential, and more about being able to thrive in relationship to others. And when we think about kind of like thriving in relationship with others, I think there's lots of different ways that we can do that. I mean, one way is through unconditional positive regard that helps us kind of, as you say, accept ourselves and discover ourselves. But I think also like sometimes like psychoeducation, like learning different skills and techniques, like, you know, some like I don't believe, like if you take something like relational skills, I don't think like there's some, you know, people are born with a kind of inner seed of knowing everything about how to relate. I think sometimes, you know, we have some amazing intuitive abilities. You look at babies, they do have this, you know, Rogers is right, they have this ability to relate. But there's also things we can learn. There's things we can learn about empathy. There's things that we can learn about kindness towards others, or understanding others, or how we perceive others. And so, for instance, things like psychoeducation potentially could have a role in helping people find a more thriving way of being. I mean, I guess if you really, it's really interesting what you're saying on that. And I guess if you really hold that belief, that model of the person, that all the potential is within someone, and the kind of process of development is and only is one of kind of growth and actualization of that inmost potential, then it does sit not easily with a kind of pluralistic practice. I mean, it has very kind of clear implications about what you could do. But I would, you know, I guess in pluralism, there's a belief that all these kind of different models of person, and it'd be interesting what David Murphy thinks about this, because this again is something that we talked about. But I think for me, all these different models of person are like different possibilities rather than any of them being truths. Like, you know, we've got existential models, we've got person-centered, we've got CBT, we've got, and the best we know from the kind of psychological world is that there's bits of truth in all of them. So I think, you know, going back to that question of respect, I think if I was sitting there with a client absolutely believing one particular model of the person, whether that was person-centered, CBT, psychodynamic, unless I was really transparent about that with a client, and a client was really aware of what I was sitting with, I think there is a danger of not being in a respectful relationship, but imposing a particular model that really not might be that client's model.
Thank you for your response, but I do really sense that the actualization tendency does like challenge the environment and let the client become who he wants, rather than like letting the society, because we already are in a structure environment, and so still having a structure in therapy, I do feel like it challenged a bit the society, because they let the client become who they are rather than somehow become and somehow I understand the technique, and thank you so much. And I do believe that some client needs that, but I do think that there is a point where the techniques cannot work. It just something else would come, so maybe they would need another technique, rather than believing in themselves, that, you know, unconditional love, loving themselves and truly accepting who they are, and empathizing with themselves, as well as, you know, being authentic. I do think that's the best self-therapy a client can learn. But I do agree that some client comes from a, you know, structure already, so they would want some structure, and that might not challenge them enough to become who they want to be.
Thanks, Anila.
Okay, so we've got 3 hands up at the moment. Nicola Blunden is next.
Hello. It does feel quite scary in this room, but it also feels quite good to be kind of unpicking this as well. And I would like to talk about something that is neither person-centered nor pluralistic in how it identifies, but I think will help me to kind of unpack what I think person-centered and pluralistic means, and put that out there to see if people kind of respond to that or not. I was looking at a report today of a therapy intervention that happened in the Grenfell Tower aftermath for young people who were impacted by the tragedy. And essentially what happened was a group of practitioners that were also impacted by the fire got together a therapy group. And they were all young people between 11 and 16. They were all kind of from Moroccan background culturally, all Muslim. And the therapists asked them how they wanted to use the space. They realized that this particular group of people never accesses therapy. So the young people decided how they wanted to use the space. They wanted to be angry. They were angry for a long time. Then they went on to incorporate grief practices, memorializing practices, prayer practices, and things that they found meaningful. And the therapists just completely went with that and allowed them the space to kind of create this year-long therapeutic group, which was incredibly kind of powerful, it seems, for the group. And they all went on to become advocates, NHS advocates for mental health practices and interventions. And there was a huge knock-on effect from this particular group of young people. And they do a lot of social justice advocacy, and they participated in silent marches and things like that. Now, to me, that feels like a person-centered response to a community that was flexible and adaptable. And there's nothing in the person-centered theory or practice that prohibits any of that. The bit that made it pluralistic for me was that there were contributions as well, in that it was co-produced with the facilitators. So facilitators also brought in some other things. So they brought in psychoeducation around stabilization. So for trauma response, they taught the young people how to stabilize their PTSD. They made opportunities for them to go and speak to MPs. They ran a big graduation event because the young people were complaining that they were seen as not achieving anything in school. And they wanted to show, look what these young people have achieved, look what they've made. And they'd made these amazing memorializing artworks with their deceased relatives depicted as birds in this beautiful kind of London Moroccan merging of cultural resource that they'd made. Now, for me, that co-producing bit, that bit of expertise that the practitioners brought in, that was in response to the needs of the young people, that's the bit that's necessary for me. Not that it's better than a purely client-led approach, but sometimes that additive bit is needed. So the young people needed that stabilization. But when I've trained person-centered kind of trainees, practitioners in the past, that leap is quite difficult to make. That leap from being very, client-led, very much following the actualizing tendency of the client and the organismic valuing of the client, to suddenly leap into being able to provide stabilization for trauma, or, move into another technique. Or what tends to happen is people either become very passive and afraid because they're afraid to be directive, they're afraid to bring in something from their own frame of reference, or they suddenly become kind of crazy with power and become really directive and end up trying to integrate on, without having understood the nuance of how they do that in alignment with the client's actualizing tendency. So what happens is you get this, in my experience, when we're talking about bad practice and people in the chat are talking about maybe in an ethos trial there was bad practice, that tends to be because people freeze because they're afraid to bring something in of their own, whether that's expertise or a perspective, and then they lose their congruence, or they become overly active and they lose their ability to follow the client's innate process. And actually, for me, the bit that pluralism offers is an explicit articulation of how you do that, how you can introduce something from outside the therapy and stay within the organismic process of the client and follow the actualizing tendency and make that kind of central. Whereas other forms of integration integrate in the body of the therapist. And that is not client-centered from my point of view. That's about the therapist integrating in a therapist-centered way. Whereas pluralism is about integrating between the therapist and client according to the client's actualizing tendency. So for me, that's the bit that makes it distinctive. It's necessary when you have to bring in other stuff, but you don't want to be up to other things, in Warner's words. You don't want to be up to other things than the client is up to. You want to be up to what the client's up to, but incorporate other stuff. So for me, I thought I just wanted to kind of give that example. The people actually don't identify as either person-centered or pluralistic. They just see themselves as co-producing therapists. But yeah, and I just wondered really what the person-centered therapists think of that. Would they see that as just, you know, purely person-centered? And if so, how do you manage that incorporation of other stuff like prayer or trauma work or whatever? And, you know, do you feel that's well articulated in the literature that we have so far in the person-centered field about how to do that? Or is there room for that, you know, to be articulated? So it's a question more for everyone, I guess. Okay.
Thanks. I don't know if you want to respond in any way to that, Mick, or
only that I think you should have had Nicola on from 6 o'clock, 6:30, describing person-centered pluralism. She put it so much better than I have. No, I think that's so clear. Thanks, Nicola.
Great. Okay, so we've got 3 hands and about 12 minutes left, so we'll see if we can get through everyone. David.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I just wanted to come back, Mick, to what you were saying before, but I've sort of partly forgotten it in response to Ornella's question, and also now feel like Nicola's posed another question that's not going to get really addressed because you've just put it out there in between a sort of dialogue, and I'm not sure what to respond to. But you know, given that you've asked that question, and I'm going to connect it in with what I wanted to say before in response to what Mick was saying, because I think things like the actualizing tendency, they make sense when you do have a particular vision of the nature of human being. But if you don't have a particular view of the nature of human being, then I can see why the actualizing tendency wouldn't be a concept that would make sense within an approach to therapy. I think a lot of the things that you were talking about in terms of that I don't know, as examples of things that might offer a critique of the actualizing tendency, I wouldn't put those in the actualizing tendency either. Neither would I put them within the actual image of a human being that Roger's set out. So I think I'd agree with you on that, but for different reasons, because I wouldn't say that they are the actualizing tendency. So I think we sort of agree, but for different reasons. So that was one thing. The other thing in regard to sort of, I think Roger's had a pretty good go at giving an explanation of what is real about a human being. And the other thing I wanted to say about Ornella's question about the incorporation of perhaps techniques or something, which is what Nicola has also mentioned there. You know, I think for me as a person-centered therapist, that I would say I sort of feel pretty much, you know, I don't know what you Mick might call the more traditional. I'm going to avoid the term classical, but the traditional client-centered therapy end of things. You know, I feel like there's huge scope for the incorporation of ways of being with clients that extend way beyond the what I believe is the mischaracterization of that way of working as being restricted to verbal empathic responses. And I actually don't see any contradiction whatsoever in terms of client-centered therapists finding ways to communicate their acceptance of the client and further ways of trying to understand the client in a congruent manner. I really don't see that as being problematic. When you say something like, how would I incorporate prayer? Well, I wouldn't incorporate prayer. If that were me doing that, then I'm leading the client. But if the client wanted to sit in front of me and pray, then I wouldn't see that as being particularly problematic. But it's not something I would incorporate to the client's frame of reference or bring it to them. you know, because that would then be rendering me an incongruent person, because I don't believe in God. So I think that would be a problem for my client if I was then trying to incorporate something that just simply didn't reflect who I am as a person. And I'm trying to be a genuine person with my client, not anything that they might need or want me to be. I don't think I could do that with integrity. You know, I could do things that I didn't believe in or that I felt compromised my own values. But I wouldn't, because I think that would actually be compromising my own integrity. So yeah, I'm kind of rolling those things together. I'm going to stop because other people want to talk.
Thanks, Dave. Can I just respond to a couple of things there? I appreciate you sharing that, David. I mean, I think that just on the actualizing technique, it's not that I disagree, it doesn't make sense to me. It's just, I think the difference is that I would just hold it lightly. I think it's a really powerful idea for some clients some of the time, but I think I wouldn't want to prioritize that or privilege that over the client's own assumptions about who they are. And I think if the client doesn't see themselves in an actualizing way, or emphasizes different bits, or has a more, say, existential view of their being, then I want to hear from the client how they make sense of it. And I think it's recognizing that view of the person as unactualizing is an assumption, and that sometimes that there's something about kind of bracketing that as well. I think that you know, I think some of this comes down to, because I hear what you say, David, about, you know, like techniques like psychoeducation. I think what you're saying, and I think sometimes people in person-centered field have said, and maybe it's mischaracterizing to say that person-centered people wouldn't do psychoeducation, because I think what you're saying, and I know Pete Saunders would say, look, if a client says, can you give me some ideas about how to deal with stress, being person-centered might well be like, here are some suggestions and here's some things you can do. The point is that you wouldn't impose it, and you wouldn't kind of be sitting there going, right, I've got some stress techniques for you. And I think we're pretty close on that. I think probably coming from a more relational standpoint, I might be inclined to think, well, there's also stuff that clients may not know about. They may not know that there's techniques. So I wouldn't, you know, if I thought, for instance, I was working with a client that there was a stress management technique, even if they didn't mention it, I might bring it in, but I wouldn't do it in the way of kind of like, here's a great technique, I think we should do this. It's like, well, perhaps there's some technique, but, you know, I really don't think we're, you know, that far away on that. But I think the point that Nicola was making, which I really thought was a really good one, is that I don't think in the person-centered field we talk enough about how we might do that. It's a bit of a dirty secret. And I think so often I hear person-centered trainees or people saying, oh my God, you know, I haven't told anyone this. I haven't told my supervisor this, but actually, you know, I do some relaxation techniques with my clients sometimes. We had it, you know, when I did my first evaluation, we had all the clients, so many of the clients were saying, I really value the relaxation techniques we did. And then we talked to the counsellors about this. Like, no, I've never done relaxation techniques. I wouldn't have done that. You know, and I think we need to be open about these things that we do use methods. And let's talk about how we do it and what's good and what's, you know, where is it that we can do it in a way that is empowering. I think we all want to do that. The reality, though, is also in ethos, and I really get frustrated when people saying, "Oh, yeah, but these weren't these were really good counsellors. These were people who really knew what they're doing. They were experienced. They were adherence checked." And it's so easy to say that because the young people weren't satisfied with it, that, oh well, you know, they weren't really person-centered counsellors. You know, there's reality there that people doing really good person-centered work, there are people who are frustrated with that. And I think to dismiss that and to try and find reasons why they weren't really person-centered is just, for me, that is so not what Rogers was trying to say. When he talks about the facts are friendly, if you look at his quote about the facts are friendly, it's all about, this is uncomfortable stuff. This is difficult. We don't like having our assumptions challenged, but if we can be open, then we can learn and we can help our clients rather than just constantly defending our position.
Hey, well, Laura had her hand up. It's down. I don't know if you wanted to say anything, Laura.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about it right now because some of the thoughts that I had were somewhat addressed just now. I think what came up for me was the issue of personal power and like while using different tools and methods in psychoeducation, and even, you know, even when the clients ask for it. To what extent, you know, like to have that awareness, maybe to what extent we take away that power from the person, because I feel like we are very much conditioned to give our power away. And I feel like my impulse was to, like my impulse would be to not want to reinforce that in any way. So like listening about like psychoeducation and using those tools and things like that, what comes up for me is that kind of resistance to that, to taking that power away, because yes, it might come from the client, but it might come from that place of being so used to giving the power away. And I think another thing that came up for me about like psychoeducation, maybe like learning like skills, and there was something about kindness and connecting to one another. And I feel like this is all very much on point. However, sometimes it can be misunderstood in a way that, like, you know, this like willingness to connect or kindness to one another, it should come from like the bodily willingness to do it, like the organismic impulse, rather than learning some sort of skills through psychoeducation, because then like that kindness, that connectedness could potentially become quite superficial or not genuine, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that if I can just respond to that, Richard, I think those are great points, Laura, and your point about, just to take that first one particularly, about psychoeducation, the risk that that is an expression of the client's external locus of evaluation, and that they are asking you to advise them in a way which is replicating their own compliance and is actually part of the problem. I mean, and that's absolutely right that that can be the case. And I think what we're also saying, and we're all kind of acknowledging, is that sometimes it can also be really helpful, and actually someone who has a genuine need for psychoeducation, and that can really contribute. And I think, you know, what's coming up for me actually as we're talking is something very, you know, I'm feeling something very positive, which is that actually if we can try and move away from black and white positions about psychoeducation is bad, psychoeducation is good, and actually in our research and in our thinking as person-centered practitioners, members of that community, thinking about, you know, how do we understand when is it helpful and when it's not helpful, rather than, you know, all or nothing. We're all saying, you know, all or nothing positions aren't helpful, but when might it be helpful? What skills do we need? What abilities do we need to be able to sense when, for a client, actually some psychoeducation there might be useful, and when do we know when it isn't? How do we find that balance between not imposing something on the client, not colluding with a particular pattern, but at the same time having the courage to maybe take a slightly more relational perspective and input something that the client might not be that aware of, or but might be helpful? These are, you know, for those of you who maybe doing research, these are such good questions to be asking. And I think, you know, whether we like it or not, the person-centered approach is sometimes characterized by this kind of passivity. Clients do sometimes experience it like that. And I think there can be a real transformation that as a field we can go through here, which is into something more flexible, more open, more responsive, more nuanced. And that's, I think, for me, the key word, more nuanced about how we're engaging with our clients, that we can really learn about.
Right. Well, I'm aware it is 8 o'clock. I don't know if you had any response to that, sorry, Laura, and or maybe we'll draw things to a close and thank Mick for agreeing to give your time and to talk about this and engage in the debate and questions. Yeah, and thanks everybody for attending. And yeah.
Thank you for the invitation, Richard. It's really lovely to meet you, and good luck with your work, everyone.
Hey.
Nice to see you. Have a nice evening.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mick.
Thank you. Bye.